For years on end, a single vehicle captured the essence of urban America. Waiting at an intersection in the Big Apple, the Windy City, or Beantown, the cab pulling up to the curb was practically identical every time. A squared-off silhouette featuring a massive rear cabin constructed to take an absolute beating. This was the checker cab. Starting in the 1950s and rolling right into the early 1980s, a lone manufacturer stealthily ran the stateside cab business Checker Motors Corporation. They ignored flashy ad campaigns and sleek styling, relying entirely on pure ruggedness. You could easily push a Checker Marathon past 500,000 miles before needing serious engine work. Cabbies absolutely adored these rides since they simply refused to die out on the road. Riders were huge fans since a half dozen grown-ups could comfortably slide into the back with extra space left over. Meanwhile, garage bosses prized them since a single Checker outlived 3 standard vehicles combined. Their main manufacturing plant, based out in Kalamazoo, Michigan, kept well over 1,000 employees busy putting together cabs that basically ran forever. They featured manually welded chassis, rear benches comfortable enough for a solid nap, and doors so incredibly hefty you needed both arms to shut them. You wouldn't even call them standard automobiles. They were literal tanks engineered to weather 20 straight years of brutal Manhattan gridlock. But eventually, back in 1982, Checker completely halted vehicle production. They just pulled the plug. The very last cab left the manufacturing floor on July 12, 1982. A plant that spent 60 long years pumping out the nation's cabs suddenly went dark. Employees who dedicated their whole lives to joining steel and dropping in motors were abruptly sent packing. Those iconic yellow Checker cabs that once gave character to downtowns across the country gradually vanished from our roads completely. Here is the tale behind the Checker cab, the most resilient automobile ever manufactured, and the way it silently faded away from the national landscape. Chapter 1. The newcomer who forged a cab dynasty. Morris Markin never showed up in the States with dreams of manufacturing cars. When he landed here in 1912, his only goal was staying alive. Originally named Mir Markin, he was born back in 1893 over in Smolensk, Russia. Being raised as a Jewish kid in that part of the world meant living under a perpetual cloud of serious everyday threat. His community survived daily knowing a sudden riot could wipe out their entire existence in a flash. Reaching 19 years of age, Markin took a massive leap that ultimately kept him breathing. He fled his homeland, heading straight for the U.S. Showing up at Ellis Island, he only had $8 to his name and a solid craft under his belt. The guy knew his way around a needle and thread. Before 12 months had passed, he found himself stitching outerwear in Chicago's fashion hub, which was far from a pretty gig. Wages were absolutely dirt poor, and the schedule was a nightmare. He pulled 12-hour stretches inside packed sweatshops lacking fresh air and full of hazardous machinery. Fast forward to 1919, and Markin scraped together sufficient cash to launch his very own enterprise, a modest apparel shop focused on ladies' jackets. He brought on fellow newcomers, primarily hiring displaced Jewish folks who shared his exact background. He offered a slightly higher wage than rival shops, maintained a tidier shop floor, and refused to shortchange his crew on their timesheets. Consequently, the operation easily stayed afloat. Markin couldn't just sit still, though. He craved a grander venture, a solid legacy that nobody could ever snatch out from under him. Come 1922, his big break finally knocked on the door, heavily disguised as a corporate failure. A business known as the Checker Cab Manufacturing Company out in Kalamazoo, Michigan, was quickly going under. They strictly produced the outer shells for cabs, not the whole vehicle, relying on frames built by outside automakers. Turns out they were deeply in debt to Markin's apparel shop for some interior fabric work. Once the cab guys defaulted on their payments, Markin pulled a completely wild card. Rather than taking the financial hit, he purchased the whole operation outright. His buddies called him out of his mind, wondering how a tailor could possibly run an auto plant. His response was pretty straightforward. He knew exactly how to construct durable goods. Whether it was jackets or automobiles, the principle remained identical. Make a quality product, and folks will happily hand over their cash. Cut corners, the thing crumbles, and your customers resent you. He simply refused to make junk. Relocating to Kalamazoo, he assumed control of the failing facility. His initial move was hitting the road to closely inspect fleet yards across the Big Apple and the Windy City. He grilled the guys behind the wheel and the garage managers alike. He wanted to know their biggest needs, what parts constantly snapped, and what actually held up over time. The overall feedback was crystal clear. Absolutely everything fell apart. Standard consumer vehicles flipped into cab service, just couldn't handle the daily beating. Running 12 hours a shift, 6 days weekly through endless bumper-to-bumper jams was just too much. Dealing with countless riders hopping in and out, plus the never-ending tossing of bags into the trunk, meant standard rides were completely trashed in under 2 years, often way sooner. The chauffeurs griped about cramped seating that murdered their backs during long stints and doors that barely cracked open, making it a complete nightmare for folks to get inside. Cargo spaces were way too tiny for big suitcases, while the shocks and struts routinely snapped under the relentless heavy lifting. Garage owners whined about outrageous mechanic bills, vehicles sitting idle, and needing to totally overhaul a fleet after just 18 months. Simply put, everyone hated what was out there. Markin laid down a massive rule that shaped his brand for the ensuing 60 years: quit trying to turn family sedans into heavy workhorses. They needed to construct a purpose-built cab completely from scratch. By 1923, the absolute first authentic Checker cab cruised right out of their Michigan plant. It stood out like a sore thumb against normal traffic, sporting a squared-off, high-roofed, and extremely practical, no-nonsense design. The back doors swung open a full 90 degrees so folks could practically stroll right in. Underneath it rocked a super thick, incredibly reinforced steel chassis. Its shock system was over-engineered to easily shrug off the endless weight cycling. Meanwhile, the motor was intentionally tuned low to prevent it from ever burning out early. While it wasn't built for speed, this machine practically lived forever on urban streets. Chicago taxi operators purchased those initial Checkers with major hesitation. 12 months later, those same buyers demanded extra units. These Checkers kept humming along long after rival vehicles ended up completely scrapped. Markin saw his massive risk succeed completely. The 1920s Chicago cab business was notoriously brutal. Rival cab fleets engaged in absolute bloodbaths. Operators routinely got smashed with heavy clubs and steel wrenches. Vehicles were torched during the late evening hours. Gunfire erupted near depots. These intense transit battles dominated front pages nationwide. Competitors literally paid mobsters to terrify opposing workers. Certain chauffeurs armed themselves. Local cops completely failed to contain the escalating bloodshed. During the 1920s, alcohol ban running a cab fleet matched the sheer ruthlessness of illegal bootlegging. Markin completely avoided that bloodshed. He took a much easier route: manufacture superior cabs and offer them at reasonable rates. The quality did the talking. While rivals wiped each other out, Checker steadily expanded in the background. Markin knew superior craftsmanship always triumphed eventually, and history proved him correct. Heading into the late 1920s, fleets wasting cash on thuggery went completely bankrupt. Meanwhile, Checker invested heavily in solid mechanical design and production, resulting in massive success. When the 1929 crash destroyed most automakers, Checker magically survived. How come, even during severe financial ruin, folks required rides? Cabs remained a crucial urban backbone, hauling executives to important corporate sit-downs. Tourists required shuttles from rail hubs. Wealthy folks continued exploring and always needed reliable transit. Fleet sizes shrank drastically, meaning any remaining cars on the street had to be practically bulletproof. The brand met those exact specifications flawlessly. Entering the late 1930s, they became the biggest cab producer nationwide. This wasn't achieved via slick commercials, but purely via ruggedness. One unit easily survived 3 standard sedans, a fact every operator understood. Industry gossip served as their absolute greatest promotional tool. Following that, World War II suddenly erupted. By 1942, normal vehicle assembly halted completely as plants transitioned to support the armed forces. Their Michigan facility paused cab creation, pivoting instead to crafting artillery shells, plane hardware, and Army transport pieces. Markin ensured not a single employee lost their job during wartime. Following 1945's victory, Checker restarted cab assembly using a fiercely dedicated, highly skilled crew. The massive post-war economic surge had just kicked off. Metropolises expanded rapidly across the nation. Returning troops settled down, relocated for urban employment, and universally required reliable street transport. The company found itself perfectly positioned. Section 2, the origin of this iconic vehicle. During 1947, they dropped the Model A4. While hardly groundbreaking, it mirrored previous iterations perfectly. It remained a workhorse crafted strictly for endurance rather than looks, setting the blueprint they'd stick with for 35 consecutive years. Exactly what separated these specific cabs from basically any other automobile out cruising around. Absolutely everything. Take the chassis, for instance. During the 1950s, everyday sedans largely shifted toward a unified shell design. This meant blending the exterior and base together, making it less heavy, highly cost-effective, and totally adequate for casual commuting. The brand completely ignored this fad. Each vehicle proudly featured independent shell and chassis construction. Massive metal tracks spanned the entire vehicle, forming a heavy-duty skeleton, and the shell simply screwed right onto it. For what reason? Because striking a street crater 5,000 times doing 40 miles per hour would literally fracture an integrated shell. Yet whenever their traditional build slammed into that exact same crater, 5,000 times, the robust skeleton soaked up the shock effortlessly. Plus its axle-to-axle span measured 120 inches. For context, a 1956 Chevy featured just a 115-inch gap. That bonus 5 inches created a totally expansive passenger section. You could easily cram half a dozen grown-ups back there without anyone feeling squished. Those back panels swung open almost 90 degrees, allowing seniors and folks with mobility issues to hop in and out with zero struggle. Just the entryways alone stood as mechanical masterpieces. Every single one tipped the scales at roughly 60 pounds. They utilized gigantic, heavily reinforced joints alongside solid steel latches instead of cheap, shiny synthetic junk. Shutting one felt like sealing up a massive vault. The deep thud instantly broadcasted pure safety and everlasting strength. Riders caught that noise and immediately recognized they were riding inside an absolute tank. It also featured long, continuous cushions across both rows. You wouldn't find divided chairs here. The massive driver's row allowed a trio of folks to squeeze up top easily. That back row casually held 3 full-grown adults or 4 if crammed. Furthermore, they included clever fold-out chairs facing the rear window, adding a couple extra spots. By law, this beast hauled 7 clients right alongside the person driving. Good luck cramming 8 humans inside an average family car. The undercarriage remained wonderfully basic, a rigid front bar paired with layered steel bands. The tail end utilized an identical rigid setup. You felt every bump because structurally it basically was a work truck. However, because of this basic design, practically any wrench turner across the United States could easily repair them. You wouldn't find complex, independent suspensions or custom components here. The springs, dampers, and bushings were completely standardized, easily swappable, and incredibly inexpensive. Power plants arrived from external vendors, primarily utilizing Continental motors before eventually switching to Chevy blocks. Markin intentionally chose power plants engineered to operate well below their absolute breaking point. If a Continental motor produced 100 horsepower inside a sports vehicle, that exact same block was tuned down to 85 for these cabs. The reason was obvious. A motor operating at just 85% of its absolute limit survived 3 times as long as one push to the edge. These cabs lacked speed, but they were absolutely bulletproof. Back in the 1950s, that Kalamazoo assembly plant provided jobs for more than 1,000 employees. There were no robotic assembly lines here. Everything was crafted entirely by skilled human hands. Chassis sections were manually fused together by veterans who had perfected that exact task over 20 years. Those fabrication zones were incredibly noisy, sweltering, and hazardous, featuring a constant shower of flying sparks. Even though the heavy stench of scorched steel and toxic vapor dominated the floor, these tradesmen genuinely cared about their craftsmanship. Shoddy fabrication guaranteed the vehicle's structural failure under heavy strain, while flawless joints ensured the chassis would easily survive for 20 years. These guys made sure they were crafting the latter. Exterior shells were assembled by experts who just had to listen to a slamming door to know if the fit was completely dead on. Whenever a latch clicked, with an off-pitch noise, feeling a little sloppy or overly snug, catching awkwardly on the strike plate, it immediately went back for tweaking. Matching up the rear sections, getting the seams right, and setting the glass were entirely manual tasks handled by folks deeply invested in the final product. Their inspection standards bordered on fanatical. Before shipping out, every single automobile underwent a thorough road evaluation. They didn't simply fire up the ignition and roll it away. They took them out on proving grounds to rigorously check the speed-stopping power and cornering while carrying heavy ballast mimicking real fares. The moment anything felt off, whether it was a tiny squeak, a slight shudder, or a hinge catching weirdly, the car was rejected. Markin frequently strolled through the production areas, pausing at different benches to ask the crew what equipment they lacked and genuinely paying attention to their ideas. He never viewed his employees as merely disposable muscle. They were the core creators of his machines, and their expertise directly dictated Checker's standing. Having multiple generations of the same family on the payroll was standard practice. Dads would actually teach their boys the ropes at the exact same benches where they had dedicated countless years. A patriarch who started fusing metal back in 1946 would pass those exact techniques down to his kid, in 1966 sweating it out right next to each other. The old man would demonstrate inherited methods, sharing specific secrets for flawless construction and clever time-saving hacks that never compromised structural integrity. This wasn't merely a paycheck. It represented a genuine art form, deep-rooted heritage, and absolute bloodline pride. The crew loved producing cabs capable of hitting the streets 20 years down the line, fully aware their personal stamp was on machinery that would outlive practically everything else in their possession. You could easily spot that exact dedication within the final completed vehicle. It was incredibly obvious from the flawless joints, perfectly aligned sheet metal, and smooth swinging hinges. These absolutely were not machines thrown together by an indifferent assembly line. Instead, they were constructed by experts who understood their craftsmanship would face harsh scrutiny 2 decades down the road while still hauling fares across New York. Halfway through the 1950s, Checker completely owned the urban cab industry. Across New York City, more than 60% of all hacks rolled out of their plant. They held a 70% share in Chicago, while places like Boston, San Francisco, and Philadelphia considered Checker the absolute baseline, and it wasn't because of flashy marketing. It all came down to word of mouth and basic math from fleet operators. Paying a higher sticker price initially meant securing a vehicle that endured triple the lifespan. Over the long haul, the operating expenses were significantly cheaper, making it an absolute no-brainer. Meanwhile, the actual wheelmen adored Checkers for completely different perks. You sat perched up high, which provided an incredible view of the street, and it could cut sharp corners effortlessly even with that massive frame. That stripped-down engineering basically eliminated most mechanical breakdowns. A cabbie could easily pull a 12-hour grind behind the wheel of a Checker without feeling completely wrecked afterward, thanks to plush cushions and a bump-free cruise. Everything on the dash was simple to operate. While riders might not have specifically recognized the Checker brand name, they definitely felt they were riding in a unique class of vehicle. Sliding through the doors was an absolute breeze with plenty of stretching space inside, and that massive rear cargo hold easily swallowed 4 giant travel bags. Gliding down the road, it was incredibly peaceful and hushed, firmly cementing Checker as the absolute gold standard for public transport. Chapter 3. The era Checker owned the asphalt. Back in 1956, Checker dropped the A8 model, which was followed up by the Marathon in 1959. Neither of these releases strayed too far from previous generations, which was entirely intentional. Checker engineers nailed the ultimate recipe and stubbornly stuck with it. The Checker Marathon eventually morphed into the ultimate American cab, carrying a title that basically shouted relentless endurance. These rigs were engineered for the extreme long haul, easily proving their worth, when marathon taxis routinely clocked 300,000 miles, with quite a few pushing past the 500,000 mark. A handful of iconic machines even busted past 600,000 miles while still out there grinding on the pavement. Official records exist showing Checker marathons hitting an insane 700,000 miles, needing nothing more than standard everyday upkeep. Just fresh fluids, stopping shoes, and new rubber. The motors refused to die, the skeletons never fractured, and those heavy doors kept slamming shut like a bank safe. Consider what that actually translates to in reality. Your average urban taxi racked up roughly 50,000 miles every single year. You could easily drive a Checker Marathon 10 years straight without major engine work. Meanwhile, rival cabs typically died around the 150,000-mile mark. Barely 3 years. Bosses basically chose between purchasing one single Checker or burning through 3 standard rides simultaneously. The math made total sense. Sure, you paid around 30% extra right off the bat compared to a Chevy or Ford, but you actually saved cash overall. Repair bills stayed cheap since components never snapped. You rarely lost working days since these vehicles avoided lengthy garage stays. They held serious resale value too. People happily bought decade-old models pushing 300,000 miles, cementing this ride as America's ultimate cab symbol. Any director shooting a 1960s Manhattan film desperately needed these rides rolling behind the main action, otherwise the footage felt totally fake. Whenever cameras captured terminal arrivals, those distinct vehicles always jammed the pickup lanes. Fast-paced getaway runs tearing down downtown blocks relied on these cars for authentic metropolitan vibes. That square, bright yellow machine cemented itself as a legendary Big Apple icon, easily rivaling landmarks like Lady Liberty and the Empire State Building. Out-of-towners landing at JFK or LaGuardia actively expected those classic rides. Sliding into that massive rear passenger area with flattened fold-out chairs essentially defined the trip. Cabbies sat isolated behind a thick divider, while the fare gauge clicked away. City streets blurring past the glass alongside that undeniable feeling of riding inside a total tank. Inside a machine existing long before your arrival and easily outliving your stay. This deep sense of timelessness, totally locked into the local streets, gave the metropolis its unique heartbeat. The film industry only supercharged that mental link. Absolutely every film set locally showcased these exact vehicles. Think of Robert De Niro cruising past those glowing neon signs in Taxi Driver. Total Checkers. When Gene Hackman frantically chased the overhead subway during the French Connection, those signature cars packed every single street corner. Midnight Cowboy. The Out-of-Towners. The Taking of Pelham 123. They flooded absolutely every road shot. Even locally shot television hits like Jack Beretta and NYPD Blue relied heavily on them as an instant visual stamp screaming Manhattan. That automobile practically merged with the town itself. However, the core foundations keeping this brand on top were teetering right on the edge. The financial math prioritizing incredible toughness alongside industry trends, rewarding truly indestructible products, started shifting. Society's preference for lifelong reliability over cheap throwaway junk was finally reaching its bitter end. The company simply remained clueless. Chapter 4. The sector starts evolving. Throughout the 1960s, their market grip appeared entirely bulletproof. Sure, they never dominated as a massive corporation churning out maybe 8,000 units annually while Ford and General Motors pumped out millions. Yet they absolutely monopolized the cab niche. That felt like enough success, or so they assumed. Warning signs popped up late in the 1960s, right when Ford and General Motors aggressively pitched sedans straight to cab businesses. The Ford Custom, eventually the Crown Victoria, alongside Chevy's Impala and Caprice. Unlike the competition, nobody designed these specifically for cab duty. Manufacturers merely took standard family rides, slapped on beefier shocks, and offered bulk pricing. Still, they brought serious perks. Detroit's Big Three brought leverage the underdog could never match, starting with dealership networks spanning every city. Hundreds of locations easily handled routine tune-ups, heavy maintenance, and full warranty claims. If a Minneapolis operator chose Ford's, he found roughly 30 garages within a 50-mile radius. Meanwhile, his closest authorized repair hub for the alternative might sit 200 miles out. They provided bulk financing rates the underdog brand absolutely could not match. You got 2% through GMAC or Ford Motor Credit, whereas banks charged 6 or 7% for the yellow cabs. Plus spare parts set everywhere. Mechanics could swap out a busted Crown Vic water pump in 60 minutes just by grabbing supplies from the closest neighborhood auto shop. Fixing that exact failure on their competitor meant shipping a box from Kalamazoo and waiting 3 straight days. Above all else, sheer volume won out. Ford willingly moved bulk orders at razor-thin profits simply because they manufactured vehicles by the millions. Profits from pushing 2 million F-150 pickups easily subsidized massive markdowns on those Crown Victoria fleets. The underdog produced merely 8,000 total vehicles and completely lacked alternative product lines. Their entire survival relied strictly on cab sales, making discounts totally impossible. Knowing this, Detroit's pitch to taxi bosses hit hard and flawlessly. They argued that while classic yellow rides survived longer, their own automobiles were 30% cheaper, upfront complete with 2% in-house financing. Better yet, whenever a part snapped, countless local dealerships already held the spares, totally eliminating any garage downtime. For modest outfits, running 10 or 20 cars, scoring easy loans, was way more crucial than fretting over lifetime operating expenses. Those smaller guys lacked the massive cash reserves to buy vehicles outright, and the big automakers happily handed over credit terms the underdog could not match. A boss facing 2% loans on Crown Vics compared to 7% for the alternative easily picked Detroit, still fully accepting it would die sooner. Cheaper monthly bills won out. Immediate cash flow easily trumped long-term financial savings. Things changed drastically when the 1973 fuel shortage hit. Foreign producers suddenly halted petroleum exports bound for America. Fuel costs skyrocketed in a flash, leaping from 35 cents up to $1.25 a gallon. Local pumps quickly emptied out. Drivers found themselves stuck in endless queues just hoping to get a full tank. The nation's financial system shook violently, making gas mileage suddenly crucial like never before. A Checker Marathon barely managed around 10 miles to the gallon downtown. Endless idling, that massive steel chassis and an underpowered motor all combined to create truly awful gas consumption. Meanwhile, a Ford Crown Victoria managed 16 miles per gallon. When driving 50,000 miles annually, that gap became incredibly significant. Paying $1.25 a gallon meant a Checker devoured more than $6,000 in fuel yearly. A Crown Vic used under $4,000. Saving $2,000 every 12 months easily outweighed any initial buying cost. After a decade, those kept funds could buy 2 brand new Crown Vics. Cab company bosses began calculating things differently. Sure, the Checker was built to outlive its rivals. Yet the cash saved on gas with a Crown Vic easily covered swapping it out sooner. Overall expenses were genuinely cheaper running the flimsier vehicle. The very core of Checker's market dominance started falling apart. Morris Markin had reached his 80s during the mid-70s. He constructed his brand around toughness and basic design. Modifying that winning recipe just to save gas absolutely disgusted him. "We manufacture the greatest cab on earth," he claimed to whoever would listen. That fact remains true. He was completely correct. The car itself stayed the same. However, consumer needs shifted, and Checker lacked the size to adapt alongside them. Chapter 5. How New Rules Crippled Checker. The 1970s introduced a flood of government mandates that struck tiny automakers far worse than anybody expected. Pollution limits, collision safety rules, bumper laws, and mileage demands. Taken separately, every single one seemed totally logical. Combined, they proved devastating to a business as small as Checker. The 1970 Clean Air Act demanded that every automobile follow strict pollution guidelines. For massive giants like Ford and GM, this required spending hundreds of millions tweaking motors and developing catalytic converters. They easily distributed those massive expenses over millions of different cars. For Checker, only producing 8,000 units annually, the financial burden per car was absolutely mind-blowing. They never even built their own power plants. They purchased motors straight from Continental or Chevrolet. Once those vendors upgraded their hardware to pass environmental tests, they shoved the extra expenses onto Checker. The company simply had to swallow the increased rates. They possessed absolutely zero bargaining power. They were just a microscopic client. Meanwhile, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration rolled out strict collision trial protocols. Front guards needed to handle 5 miles per hour hits. Flank defense became necessary. Smashing cars for research became compulsory for massive auto builders. Meeting these benchmarks required refreshing older blueprints. The big guys were already tweaking things just to look modern anyway. But for Checker, a brand that barely touched its exterior layout since 1956, it demanded insanely costly structural overhauls without any cash to fund them. The corporate average fuel economy guidelines established strict gas mileage goals across entire vehicle lineups. Checker's complete catalog consisted of massive body-on-frame cabs chugging a miserable 10 miles to the gallon. They fell laughably short of the legal limits and couldn't possibly catch up without starting from scratch. Rebuilding their signature ride meant spending tens of millions of dollars. Checker simply lacked those tens of millions in the bank. Giant automakers offset their regulatory expenses through diverse inventories. Ford dropped cash fixing the Mustang, then quickly recovered it by moving millions of F-150 pickups. Checker exclusively manufactured a single model. Every single buck blown on government rules had to be pulled straight from cab profits. No alternative income existed. Approaching the late 70s, every vehicle they shipped actually drained cash. Building the things cost more than what buyers paid. The sole method to generate income required bumping up sticker tags. Yet taxi operators were already flocking toward more affordable Crown Vics. Hiking the sticker tag would only speed up that mass exodus. Checker found themselves trapped in a complete nightmare. They lacked the funds to modernize their lineup for federal mandates. They also couldn't keep assembling the classic models since those legal fees destroyed their profit margins. Plus, going toe-to-toe with Ford and GM's pricing was impossible. Chapter 6. The final Checker leaves the factory. On April 6, 1978, Morris Markin passed away at 89. He started Checker 56 years prior. He transformed a struggling repair garage into the nation's premier cab supplier. He navigated the Great Depression, World War II, and 60 years of cutthroat rivals. Yet he didn't live to witness the coming storm. His boy David Markin took over a rapidly sinking ship. Output during 1978 plummeted to 3,000 units, well under 50% of their 1960s golden era. A plant that once housed over 1,000 employees now barely sustained 400. The vast majority of the assembly line gathered dust. David Markin threw every Hail Mary possible to rescue Checker. He even marketed the Marathon toward everyday buyers as a spacious family cruiser. Ads highlighted the massive rear cabin, the rugged build, and domestic production. It totally flopped. Folks simply refused to buy personal vehicles resembling ups. Consumers avoided 10 miles a gallon during high fuel prices. That signature design giving those cabs their legendary status completely ruined any civilian sales. The boss pivoted towards subcontracting, producing parts for GM alongside crafting specialized rigs for niche applications. The plant pumped out limos, hearses, and terminal shuttles, doing whatever it took to keep machines humming and crews paid. However, outsourced gigs offered razor-thin profits with totally erratic demand. It simply fell short. Around 1980, annual output plummeted down to roughly 1,000 automobiles. The facility operated a single rotation rather than three. Veterans boasting 30 years on the line faced termination. Those still punching the clock understood the final curtain was approaching. The proof was obvious in vacant work zones, silent conveyor belts, and employee lots that once bustled but now sat barren. The financial math was brutally straightforward. The automaker bled cash on every vehicle purchased. Sluggish output caused steep individual expenses. Boosting production remained the sole fix for trimming overhead, yet numbers kept plunging instead of climbing. It became a fatal nosedive. In 1982, David Markin made the tough call. They would permanently cease building motor cars. The news dropped without any grand celebrations or media events, merely offering a muted declaration that following 60 solid years, the brand was abandoning the automotive industry. That final Marathon model drove away from the Kalamazoo plant on July 12, 1982. It was vehicle number 829 that year. That perfectly illustrates the drastic manufacturing nosedive. 829 vehicles across 12 months contrasted sharply against 8,000 annually throughout the 60s. No parties were thrown, nor were there commemorative employee meetings to honor the conclusion of 60 years of industrial history. Employees punched their time cards fully aware their vehicle building days were over. A few shed tears. The majority simply headed back to their houses in silence, gripping their meal pails for the final trip, completely ignoring the plant, providing their lifelong livelihoods. Generational family careers concluded instantly. Dads laboring beside their boys were abruptly split up. One 64-year-old fabricator starting in 1946, boasting 36 years fusing chassis, departed carrying a tiny payout without retirement benefits. He felt too youthful for a rocking chair, yet overly aged to secure similar employment. Nobody recruits a 64-year-old metalworker exclusively trained on cab skeletons. Laborers devoting 30 years to fusing those iconic undercarriages suddenly learned their craftsmanship was entirely obsolete. All that niche expertise they had gathered, like fusing those exact seams, ensuring the underbellies remained basically bulletproof, mastering exterior alignment so entries click shut seamlessly, past 200,000 miles, or cruising a taxi while diagnosing invisible mechanical quirks. That unique mastery lost value overnight. These simply were not translatable talents. They remained strictly brand-specific abilities. Once production halted entirely, those special capabilities turned completely useless. The facility avoided total shutdown. They pivoted toward outsourced fabrication, stamping out components for outside corporations. Yet the core mission defining Kalamazoo across 60 years, crafting those legendary taxis, was officially dead. The golden cruisers that once dominated American metropolises were permanently out of production. Meanwhile, the existing fleets currently roaming the avenues just kept on rolling. A handful logged miles for 15 more years. New York City saw its final active cruiser retire during 1999, 17 years following the factory shutdown. That specific vehicle clocked above 400,000 miles and remained operational upon its ultimate decommission. This validated Morris Markin and his claims regarding longevity. Sadly, it also highlighted exactly why the company failed. Chapter 7. The cab that turned into a vintage memory. Today, these rides represent pure nostalgia. Historical exhibits display them. Enthusiasts rebuild them. Antique auto conventions proudly showcase them. Movie sets lease them to capture authentic 1960s or 70s. New York vibes, yet avenues formerly swarming with thousands now hold zero. That Kalamazoo plant remains upright. It transitioned into alternative industrial purposes. The labor force vanished ages ago. A few stepped down. A handful scored fresh gigs. Others never collected another paycheck. Those deep-rooted family careers shaping the facility for ages vanished alongside the completion of that final vehicle. Throughout modern media, the brand stays frozen as the ultimate emblem of a bygone age. The 1950s through the 70s, post-war urban landscapes, an era where cabs meant roomy golden rides featuring fold-out chairs and cabbies navigating completely without digital maps. That universe disappeared forever. The brand vanished alongside it. Vintage marathons still pop up at auto expos, refurbished to mint shape. Proprietors rave about the solid construction, unmatched ruggedness, and straightforward engineering. These cruisers gain serious worth strictly because they are extinct. The exact resilience that bankrupted the firm makes the surviving fleet incredibly treasured. Across almost 5 straight decades, these iconic cruisers successfully drove the nation homeward. Between runways and motels, transit hubs, and corporate hours clinics, to front porches, totaling millions of rides, billions of miles, and infinite stories. Then suddenly, during 1982, the fleet vanished. The facility fell silent. Employees clocked out forever while avenues gradually lost those iconic yellow cabs that felt permanently etched into city history for generations. Chapter 8. The Core Takeaways. This legendary paradox is straightforward. Crafting an indestructible item simply cannot survive financially when selling directly to the general public. First takeaway, longevity ruined recurring revenue. Their flagship model easily survived 15 to 20 years, meaning cab companies made single purchases without ever needing replacements. Contrast this against standard sedans, which required swapping out every 5 years. Rivals moved 3 vehicles for every single unit shipped by our niche maker. Higher volume equaled massive profits, streamlined manufacturing, and far cheaper production overhead. That legendary toughness ultimately backfired heavily. Crafting the ultimate riding machine literally wiped out their entire future buyer base. Second takeaway, finances shifted and management completely failed. Adapting. Through the 1950s and 60s, rock-bottom gas prices made toughness king. Come the 1970s, soaring pump rates completely erased any maintenance savings. Whatever financial logic drove purchases in 1960 turned completely upside down by the time 1975 rolled around. Their sole industry edge relied upon a financial climate that had simply vanished forever. Third insight, massive volume dictates surviving new government rules. Think pollution mandates, strict mileage benchmarks, and rigid safety impact laws. Sure, these laws played no favorites, hitting every brand alike. Yet meeting those strict standards absolutely crushed smaller, boutique automakers. Giants dropped $200 million on exhaust rules across 2 million units, adding exactly $100 per vehicle. They spent $10 million across 8,000 vehicles, adding over $1,000 per car. Independent builders stood zero chance against that brutal math. Fourth takeaway, fighting progress spells total doom during industry shakeups. Morris Markin's genius throughout the 20s and 50s became his ultimate downfall during the 60s and 70s. His stubborn dedication to crafting an immortal cab, refusing to ever tweak a winning blueprint, alongside putting ruggedness before absolutely everything else, paid off huge when buyers prioritized lifespan. But once consumers demanded better mileage and cheaper stickers, his entire approach died out completely. He wouldn't pivot. David inherited that stubborn streak right alongside the family business. Fifth takeaway, cornering a tiny sector leaves you wide open to mainstream giants. They absolutely controlled the cab sector. However, specialized corners only remain secure whenever corporate heavyweights simply cannot aggressively compete. The minute Detroit giants targeted bulk buyers and that tight grip vanished. Lacking massive production scale nationwide, lots dedicated, lending branches, or any real competitive pricing power, they were completely sunk. Ruling a tiny puddle ends disastrously the second actual sharks slide into those same waters. Was survival even possible? Highly unlikely operating as a mainstream vehicle producer. Perhaps leaning into pure luxury, crafting the ultimate executive transport, and ditching regular transit fleets entirely might have actually worked. Or perhaps cashing out to an industry giant during the early 70s could have saved them. Yet the Markin family rejected buyouts, fiercely protecting an empire they raised from absolutely nothing. Cashing out meant accepting failure. They stubbornly held tight until the brand became completely worthless. Here rests the ultimate plot twist. Those surviving relics on roads today completely validate Morris Markin regarding sheer toughness. Pristine 1960s models fire up instantly, cruising streets flawlessly even now. Several boast beyond 500,000 miles while purring exactly like they just left the showroom lot. These machines stand as total validation for his mechanical vision. Ironically, they also highlight exactly how that mindset bankrupted everything entirely. Any functional unit spotted today represents yet another buyer dropping cash a single time, completely bypassing any future upgrades whatsoever. Each remarkably maintained classic parked at local auto meets proves that engineering indestructible gear guarantees a single transaction before that client walks away forever. The brand absolutely nailed its objective, building history's toughest cab. Ultimately, achieving that specific dream proved totally fatal. Whenever you spot a gleaming vintage unit sitting pretty at festivals or on screen, keep this tragic reality right in mind. 1,000 dedicated folks crafted those machines tough enough to survive 20 years, chasing sheer perfection, utterly crushed returning clientele. The vehicles definitely thrived. The business absolutely tanked. Do you recall your very first trip sitting inside one? That massive rear cabin, incredibly solid frames, and sensing you were cruising inside an armored vault? Or maybe you actually got to steer one professionally yourself. Drop your personal memories down below. If this changed how you view these vintage workhorses, smash that like button and subscribe for further deep dives into legendary domestic brands that completely vanished. Those iconic rides haven't completely disappeared, safely tucked away inside private galleries. Yet the assembly floor stays hushed. Staff moved on while avenues previously jam-packed with bright cabs simply vanished.